Hello, and welcome to the Gamecraft Podcast. I'm your host, Mitch Lasky.
I'm Blake Robbins.
And this is a podcast about the business of video games. Episode 8, Artificial Intelligence. So, Blake, usually we start off these episodes with a bit of an overview of the topic that we're going to be discussing, and we have some prepared comments, and we try and put a framework around it. I think in this episode, we're going to struggle to do that for a variety of reasons, and I think it's sort of interesting, and I think it helps us understand how hard it is to wrap our arms around this topic, that we are really going to just jump in and try and make sense of it.
Yeah, I mean, this is a beast of a topic, and I mean, we will have a bajillion different disclaimers on this episode of even by the time we release this, which will probably be a couple days from now, everything could change. But AI and artificial intelligence is just too big of a topic in games and just software broadly for us not to do this episode.
So I'd like to start up the episode with a couple of those caveats, as you indicated, right? And the first one is to remind everybody of something that we at Benchmark call Kohler's dictum, because Matt Kohler came up with this to describe kind of how we saw our jobs as venture capitalists. And that was that venture's job is not to predict the future, but to see the present very clearly. And I think that is absolutely imperative in this conversation about AI, because it's so easy to look at some of the early signs that we're seeing from the generative AI movement and even from the older machine learning environments that we're sort of emerging from, that generative AI is kind of a subset of, and extrapolate wildly into the future. And you know what? We may do that in this episode, but I want to say that we're doing that without our venture capitalist hats on, right? Because with the venture capitalist hat on, I think we're going to try and be a little bit more grounded and try and see what's going on around us, evidence that we can see of the use and the importance of AI in gaming. But we're not going to be as speculative, perhaps, as we could be under these circumstances. And I think it's fair, right? Because, as you know, I've been very cautious about things like virtual reality. I've been very cautious about things like Web3 in games. I've been very cautious about many of these sort of hype cycle technologies. I'm long AI as an investor, but I think it's worth being cautious.
Yeah, and I think it's, for this episode, we're going to talk a lot about where we do see opportunities in the present. And so not as much even speculating on the future, but far more of like, with what we know about AI today, where is that immediately valuable? Where can that make a real impact on organizations or teams and games? I think that will be much more the framework of this episode, rather than we're sitting here and pontificating about all of the different ways this is going to break everything, or I don't know, we're all just we're all just playing some completely different game in the future. Yeah,
this isn't a software's eating the world kind of episode, right? So, and one of the things that I wanted to start with before we really get into the meat of it is to remember that, we're going to be talking about a lot of interesting ideas, a lot of interesting methods of utilizing AI in the games business. All of those things will have human costs as we move forward. And we are going to be enthusiastic about those technologies, but we are also cognizant of those human costs. Obviously, we're recording this episode at a time when job losses in the video game industry are a significant issue. I mean, we're looking at 16, 17, 18,000 layoffs in the last 14, 15 months. And it's an extremely important problem. And I hate to say it, but I believe that AI is going to make that worse on a certain level if AI becomes broadly adopted in the ways that we're going to be describing it, because a lot of what it will do is create efficiencies that will require, hopefully, fewer people to make video games. And I think that's just broadly the case. And if that's the case, then I think it will continue to contribute to that problem. And we're aware of that problem and we're sensitive to it. We're not going to ignore it, but we're going to be enthusiastic about some of these technologies, and we're going to talk about their business implications, because I think it's extremely important for everyone in the video game business to acknowledge them and to move forward cognizant of the fact that there is going to be collateral damage. I would say the last disclaimer, right, not to belabor it, but this was a really important one, is the fact that we are at a very early stage of legality and regulation with regard to artificial intelligence and the use of artificial intelligence, in particular, the infringement, copyright or otherwise, related to training models, right? I think that is extremely important to focus on at this early stage, because we are going to be operating in the games business and in many other businesses under this somewhat uncertain regime of not really understanding if our uses of this technology are in fact legal for some period of time. And I think you see that represented, for example, in Steam's recent AI guidelines that they put out, where, to quote, under the Steam distribution agreement, you promise Valve that your game will not include illegal or infringing content and that your game will be consistent with your marketing materials. Now, seems pretty vanilla on the surface, kind of inarguable that you would just, ask someone for an indemnification against potential future infringement. It's a very common clause in many contracts, distribution contracts, for example. However, under the circumstances that we are going to be operating, if you are using a generative AI, a large language model, for example, like Midjourney or DALL-E or something like that to generate art, you don't really know what they've trained that art on and whether or not that art is going to be able to be used free of any kind of copyright. And I think that's going to create a degree of uncertainty around a lot of the use of this technology moving forward until we really have sort of the opinion of the courts and the opinion of the legislators who will give us some guidance on how these discrepancies and these disputes are going to be adjudicated.
Yeah, and I think we'll talk about this a little bit later on in the episode when we just talk about the incumbents. And you could certainly imagine the incumbents being the ones who are most nervous to open themselves up to a lawsuit like this.
Well, and the incumbents also have that distinct advantage that we're seeing in some of the most cutting edge uses of the large language models, in that they have access to proprietary training data. I mean, you see, for example, Reddit, for example, in their most recent S1 filing to go public later on this year, they disclosed that they have a deal with Google to essentially license the Reddit data in order to train a large language model. And you're going to see a lot more stuff like that. And I think it may be one of those things that will inure to the benefit of incumbents in the video game space who possess those libraries that could potentially be used to train artificial intelligence.
Super interesting.
So I think the way to start this conversation is to talk a little bit about AI in the context of a framework. We're going to talk about content generation in the first instance. We're going to talk about responsive and adaptive video game experiences. And we're going to talk about behavior analysis and player preference, right? Those are sort of the big topics that we're going to discuss in terms of sort of the practical uses of this technology. So let's start with content generation. And I think this is the easiest one.
Yeah, the most obvious and the one that we're going to just see ripple throughout the entire industry is on the coding side. That if you just think of these as purely software and games as some elements of software, the coding side of this is one place that you and I obviously also look at software businesses and spend a lot of time with just pure software businesses. And it's clear if you talk to any engineer who's using a GitHub Copilot or anything of the sort, they're feeling the efficiencies, and and in some level it's reducing the headcount or the need to scale up on that side.
I think that's going to be one of the most important contributions. And having tried out GitHub Copilot, I'm not much of a programmer, but to the extent that I am, it's miraculous on a certain level. And I think we've seen examples and certainly heard anecdotally of examples of people who were probably at my level of engineering, which is, you spend most of your time in Stack Overflow trying to figure out why your code is not working. And I think Copilot in the GitHub context is a almost sort of miraculous technology in that regard. And I think it will elevate some junior programmers to be able to contribute code, really high quality code, to an engineering project in a way that's never really been possible before. Typically, you've had a very bright line between engineers and kind of scripters. And I think that Copilot and Copilot-like technologies may really blur that line.
Yeah, it also empowers, let's say, the pure creative or artist before who was maybe completely inaccessible of building it on their own or actually coding in any of this logic themselves. We're in a new world where that amazing game designer might actually now be able to go and code it themselves, which again, it just talks to how much this is going to change this world.
The other aspect of this, which we really haven't seen manifest yet, but which I'm very much looking forward to seeing, is having some of these tools like Copilot built into the engines themselves, into future engines. So not just Unity or Unreal Engine, but maybe future engines that actually have these kinds of tools inherent in them, so that with prompts you can generate scaffolding, because that's so important, right? It's like I would say that I'm not a huge believer in this idea that games are going to be generated purely from prompts, right? Maybe, okay, some match 3 games we'll talk about later, some really low-hanging fruit may be susceptible to that. But I think for the sort of AAA artistically rich games that we are fans of, it's very likely that those are still going to be generated by humans over time. But it may be that the scaffolding for those games, the basic event loops, the basic structures, might be able to be generated very quickly and prototypes generated based on prompts. And I think that's going to be something very useful in the games industry, because getting to something playable, something visualizable as quickly as possible, at least in my experience as a developer and a publisher, is a great indicia of potential downstream quality.
I completely agree. And I think there's another piece, which is there's a chance that this reduces the switching costs between engines, where it's like, hey, I built this in Unity. Help me figure out how to switch this to I don't know, Unreal or Godot or something else. And look, it might not be perfect, but it will certainly get you there far closer than you having to go and hire a consultant or someone else to just take 6 months to go and do that. So there's that piece. But then there's also, like, in the world where we're going to be in a cross-platform world, which you and I have talked about a bunch, you could totally imagine it's like, okay, I built this for PC, and let's say Unity and Unreal already help on doing cross-platform. But now you're like, I have a Nintendo deal, and they're saying, hey, here's the specs. You could totally imagine this drives down that cost or extra effort dramatically.
Yeah, I mean, the idea of like free porting basically is a very attractive one in the video game business, because that is a significant cost, and it is not sexy work. Just getting
completely unsexy and time consuming.
Absolutely. I think one of the great things about all of these tools is that they are going to level the playing field to a great degree between the very large teams and the typically smaller teams that we associate with independent developers. And I think that's a very good thing, right? It may be tough for the engineering teams at some of the larger incumbents in terms of sort of their staffing needs if these tools really take off and if they are developed over time. But by the same token, I think it does potentially empower independents to compete really much more effectively with the incumbents, because they could potentially access multiple platforms. They could potentially access features and other aspects of game design that are somewhat inaccessible due to their lack of engineering talent.
And in games specifically, we've know just from spending as much time as we do in the industry, is that team size is not really indicative of success in this world. And we have countless examples of single person teams really having big success. And so if that's true, I mean, it likely means we're going to see a lot more of that going forward, and maybe even just the stuff that a solo developer can do looks far closer to even a AA or AAA type game rather than the pure indie.
Let's turn to art. So I think this is a place where we've seen, maybe second only to coding, the greatest leaps forward from the availability of these generative AI tools. Whether it's Photoshop and the sort of draw-in, I don't know what they call it, but this
Firefly,
right? That they allow you to take a photo and then fill in the part that you didn't take the photo of with AI-generated art assets. I think in the games business in general, we tend to overlook just how much art and how much drudgery there is in the art pipeline. you think about just the example I like to use is, you're building MMO and there's, 10 cities, and each of those 10 cities has 10 buildings, and each of those 10 buildings has 10 rooms. And every one of those rooms needs a table and chairs and furniture and rugs and whatever. And it's consoles if you're in a sci-fi environment. I mean, who knows? But human beings have to generate those art assets, and they have to be differentiated, and they have to be approved and the like. And I think eliminating some of that drudgery with the ability to really automate a lot of that process through large language model, AI, generative AI, could be incredibly useful in the video game business. And I think that's going to be one of the places we're going to see the most immediate impact of generative AI beyond Copilot.
I completely agree. I mean, I think about a game like Grand Theft Auto or something, and it's like, what the heck? Like the fact that this was all human made, or on some level, it's like artisanal work, and we're entering this new world of that is not sexy work at all for that artist to be sitting there and going and drawing 10,000 tables. And so even in the context of what we're talking about of yes, this will impact that side of the industry, it really is not the sexiest work. And in theory, the best artists shouldn't be spending their time drawing the table. So I completely agree with that. And then I think there's the other piece, which is there's sort of an open discussion, which is, do you have the Photoshops and of Fireflies and that world's continue to win in this space? Or is there more of a first principles approach, similar to what you were saying on the coding and the engine side? Is there going to be someone that builds this from an actual native side of understanding the art pipeline and all of the nuances within gaming and building it more native that way? Those are where my heads go, or where my head goes within this industry.
And I think the answer is undoubtedly yes, right? I mean, you look at something like, recently Andrew Wilson, the CEO of Electronic Arts, was talking about their use of AI in the art pipeline. And he was talking about FIFA run animations, right? For the soccer game, and said that hand coded in the old days, they could do in the low hundreds. And with the addition of artificial intelligent asset generation, they were able to increase that to something like over 1,000 potential run animations. And so again, adding that kind of variability into the game provides a level of realism, right? It provides a level of verisimilitude that we want in those sorts of games. For example, in a sports game where we don't want everybody to run the same way.
Yeah, it's. I mean, and you and I have talked to a couple companies around the physics side of this, and that's just another piece of this, which is just like the fact that in a game like FIFA, they're actually going and doing motion capture of a player and their style and whatever else. It's like, man, we're in the first inning, and I think when we look back in 10 years, it's gonna be like, I can't believe that was how we ever did this, and it's like there's a million times more accurate.
Putting ping pong balls on a human being and having them run around in a soundstage, right? I mean, it's like, no, like, get me every video of Tony Hawk that's ever been produced and send it through a training model and deduce his style from his actual skating, right? Rather than the abstraction of putting him into a soundstage with little ping pong balls all over his body.
That's such a crazy thought.
So I think the third component to this is really on the design side. And I want to spend a little bit of time talking about this because I think this is super interesting. I think there's a couple of aspects of the design side of games that could be susceptible to AI tools and the development of AI tools going forward. I think one of them very clearly is level layout, just the ability to generate, many, many, many iterations of potential levels based on prompts, right? I think could be extremely useful at the prototyping stage, right? To be able to quickly view them, to eliminate the ones that don't work. And again, there's quite a bit of human skill involved, obviously, in level layout. And I think with the right kind of training and the right kind of coaching, if you will, the AI will be particularly useful in terms of building levels.
Yeah, I mean, it's especially, and this is where I get excited around a lot of this stuff, is when you think about the $60 box good game or the indie game today that has a set number of levels, you could actually imagine that AI opens that up to be more of a free-to-play game where something that, I don't know, let's say a game like Hades would have never believed or thought that they could have infinite level generations or that side of it. We're now in this new world of, you could have 10,000 levels generated in, call it a month. Whereas right now, they're like hand drawing that, they're hand thinking through the logic, they're testing all the breaking of that. That to me is just like, oh my gosh, we might actually have a paradigm shift of every game can actually be a free-to-play game or a live ops type game moving forward.
Yeah, I think it was interesting. I was, in doing research for this, I came across something that I was surprised that I had missed. That was a talk that the Microsoft team and the Relic team gave at GDC a couple of years ago about their use of deep learning models in the creation of Age of Empires 4, a game very near and dear to my heart. So that's partly why I'm surprised I didn't focus on it. But they were describing their use of AI in the context. And remember, this game is insanely complicated, right? It's like they launched with 8 civilizations, 300 or more units, each of those, across the board, like 150 upgrades in terms of buildings and units and all of these other kinds of attributes of the game, and the combinatorial possibilities of all of those things in combat situations and build orders and other things like that is just mind-boggling, right? It's a staggeringly complicated problem. And they were talking about this really more in the context of developing opponent AI in order to wield these tools within the game, to be able to control units, to do strategies appropriately, attacking, defending, micro and macro. But one of the terms that they used, which kind of stuck with me, was this idea of supervised learning. And I think that concept of supervised learning is something that I think is very important and very interesting, which is this idea that you don't just let the AI run wild, essentially, right? You do kind of utilize it in the way that it is really amazing, which is to iterate very quickly on some of these things, to solve some of these very complex problems, to anticipate things that you might not have anticipated, but then to bring the human component back into it and say, is this fun? Is this necessary? Are we overcomplicating it? And I think in the level design, and even on to balancing, which may seem mathematical, but obviously has a really important fun component to it as well. I think there is a role for sort of the human guide in this supervised learning model. And I love that metaphor. I love that paradigm.
It's so, it's the fact that a lot of this stuff is manually done. Again, I think we're going to look back and be like, well, one, that person was a genius, the fact that they were doing this. But it's also like, that was crazy that you were even able to solve this stuff. I think about, let's say League of Legends, where you have 100 plus characters or champions in the game. And every time they introduce a new character, it breaks it, right? The unique dynamics of how those match up or whatever can break all of the math of this balancing. And on some level, they're doing the math, they're doing simulations, they're doing testing, but you could just totally imagine like that time that they're spent doing that is dramatically reduced moving forward, which, you might argue today that is a huge cost center of what they're doing, which is how do we make sure the game doesn't break when we actually introduce new stuff in this live operations world and where our players want the competitive integrity to stay the same. That's a lot of what Riot has the secret sauce on. And we're entering a new world of that might be available to everyone.
Yeah, and so that brings us to the next component of this, which is responsive and adaptive video game experiences. And so really, in order to think about this, it's useful to go back a little bit and think about game playing AI in general, right? And it is very relevant to what you just discussed, right? Because obviously, in order to determine if the introduction of a new champion in League, for example, is disruptive to the existing structure and the existing balance, you've got to have an artificial intelligence capable of playing the game at a relatively high level in order to take advantage of potentially those, we'll call them arbitrage opportunities that may exist, where where certain strengths, certain weaknesses, certain powers may need to be nerfed or buffed or whatever. So what is the history of game playing AI? I think it's really interesting going all the way back to the earlier days of the video game business. It was really the common opponent AI, right? It was single player games, particularly single player games that had an opponent, had to have some kind of an illusion of intelligence that was capable of playing against you. And I think one of the more famous examples of this was Danny Berry's Mule, where she introduced this idea of randomness into the way that the AI would play against you, and also this idea of flaws, where the AI would make mistakes, like intentionally on the programmer's urging, and that produced an illusion of intelligence, the illusion of playing against a human opponent that was much stronger than even the quality of play that the so-called AI was able to generate against you. Super interesting. And again, it led to many, many years of development of these kinds of very heuristic, very sort of old school AI approaches to opponent creation. And a lot of interesting questions, like how much information should the AI have? Should the AI have the same kind of information that the player has? And should it have a fog of war? Or should it be able to cheat? Should it know what it should do in advance? And I think these were concerns that we dealt with over and over and over again in those earlier days of the video game business.
It's such a crazy concept because, people who play games, they'll be like, man, this like bot is terrible. And it's terrible by design because, we know that if they just turn it up, it actually gets far on the spectrum of like, well, I can't even compete. Like they're seeing through walls and they're like hitting my head every single time. Like it doesn't even make sense. And so I think that's such a strange phenomenon, and it's interesting to think about how that gets solved or maybe doesn't get solved in this new paradigm. But even we were talking about, let's say, Call of Duty or a campaign mode or something like that before this, where up until a couple of years ago, it's literally you select a track of difficulty and it's like, do you want the easy mode, do you want the medium hard, or like hard, or like the hardest mode? And really what those are is just like a fine-tuned version of like how much we've buffed or nerfed the bots in this world.
Yeah, I mean, look, you see this in chess, right? And chess was one of the most interesting problems in this idea of machine learning and gameplay. And back in '97, you had IBM's Deep Blue, this sort of chess playing computer, which was relatively brute forcey, right? In the idea that it was looking, heuristically 7 moves ahead on the board and looking for these sort of ideal paths and outcomes and probabilistic outcomes. But in '97 beats Garry Kasparov, who was a grandmaster, and did it in the context of this game that was kind of at least romantically thought of as like an attribute of human intelligence, right? That like, a grandmaster chess player was an expression of a particular kind of human intelligence. And so I think it was shocking and interesting back in '97 when Deep Blue was able to beat Kasparov. And now it seems silly because we have you could go online to chess.com and there's like chess engines that are everywhere that play at an extraordinarily high level that you could even run locally. They don't even require the kind of room-sized computational power that was required back in the '90s. And it's become such an issue that they've had to legislate it for some of, in these online tournament play. The chess engines are so ubiquitous that they've just become a huge cheating problem within chess, because you could get real-time answers to problems that used to take, days or more to solve.
Yeah, I mean that's the tip of the iceberg. Where we're at today is just even crazier.
The next really interesting development was a further refinement of that machine learning model, which I think is often referred to as deep learning. And you had DeepMind from Google, 2016, come up with this algorithm to play Go that a year later led the machine to defeat the number one Go player in the world. And again, a game of tremendous subtlety and strategy, and a remarkable achievement. And I want to tell the story behind it because it's really interesting. There's a video game story behind this, which is Demis Hassabis, who was in charge of DeepMind during this period and is, I think, today the head of all of Google's AI research, came from the video game business. He worked for Peter Molyneux at Bullfrog Studios in the UK, very, very famous development company of incredibly innovative games. Molyneux is again, one of the great game designers of all time. And he had this penchant of going and hiring these incredibly smart math people out of Cambridge University. He had kind of a pipeline to the smartest people at Cambridge in the math department. And he found Demis when Demis was, I think, 16 or 17 years old, and brought him to Bullfrog and had him working on various projects. And then when Molyneux left Bullfrog and started Lionhead Studios, I went over to the UK to try and figure out a deal to get Molyneux to do a game for us at Activision. And that ultimately happened. It happened after I had it came to market after I had left. It was a game called The Movies. But I spent a bunch of time with Peter, and Peter introduced me to Demis, who he had encouraged to start his own company at that point and build a game. And the game Demis wanted to make was this game called Republic, which was this vastly complicated political simulation where you had to play a faction, and using ideology and force, you had to seize power. And it was one of the most fascinating pitches I've ever heard, although it seemed absurdly difficult to actually execute. And I think it finally did come to market, but in a much, much more reduced form from what it was originally pitched to me as. But I got to spend some time with him, which was extremely interesting. And to hear the way he talked about games and the way he talked about this idea, particularly of games with intelligent agents, which he was thinking about all the way back in the late 90s.
It's so crazy. I mean, it's again, the fact that you're there in these moments is just a testament to you and where you've been. You've always been at the right seat at the table. But it's I mean, Demis is an absolute legend in this space, and it's fun to see that they've done little odes to gaming where they defeat Go, but then they defeat StarCraft at a pro level as well a couple of years later, and so it's fun to see that they continue to explore in that world.
Yeah, the Alpha Star implementation, which was the StarCraft playing version of DeepMind, is super interesting. And it was super interesting. It's super interesting to go and read some of the descriptions that the pro players had playing against it, because it was so good that it required them to really go weird in terms of how they would play against it. So, for example, one player was describing how he went all air assets essentially in the game in order to defeat it, because it sort of took it out of its comfort zone to a certain extent. And you wouldn't necessarily want to do that perhaps against a human opponent, but understanding how the deep learning algorithm led DeepMind to these certain strategies was interestingly capable of being used against it.
But it goes back to even what we were just talking about at the beginning of this section, which is by having AlphaStar go and play StarCraft and beat a pro level team, what that really means is like it figured out what are the ways that this is broken or exploitable, or and sort of breaks the balancing, which means that it also can solve the balancing.
Exactly.
And like it's just a crazy unlock. And then, a couple of years later, you had OpenAI do the same thing with Dota 2. And so like this is like the fact that you're doing this with these games that are incredibly complex, like these there's so many different moving parts in these games. You talked about Civ, and it's like, okay, Dota 2, the amount of factors that is going on in that, and then the coordination, the fact that they're able to solve this means like, wow. And this is a couple of years ago at this point. And so with all the recent advancements, like, wow, we're entering a golden age of that side of this too.
So one of the most immediate implications of this, I think, is for quality assurance and play testing. This seems to be one of the areas of the lowest hanging fruit, potentially after Copilot and some of the art asset generation. And that is just this ability to train an artificial intelligence to play a game, and to do it now potentially through prompting and large language models in a way that's dynamic, so that instead of just training a sort of unitary AI to play a game in a certain way, looking for bugs and looking for other cheeses and things like that, you could potentially prompt the AI to play in a certain way. I mean, you and I were teasing about the idea of an economic simulation, for example, like EVE Online, training an AI to get rich and see what it does in an economic game like that, right? Something as simplistic as that. And I do think that is super interesting and is going to be an area of of extraordinary progress, I think, over the next couple of years. I think we'll see some of the most immediate progress in that area if I want to step out on the ledge a little bit. Looking at again, Electronic Arts, who seems to be really embracing this AI idea in an interesting way. They've developed a prototype bot years ago that played Battlefield 5, and then they used refinements of that bot to play Apex Legends and Star Wars Battlefront and even some of the PopCap casual games, and use it for play testing and for quality assurance testing. And in addition, we've seen a new company recently started called Model.ai, which is very interesting. It's a company I've definitely spent a little bit of time taking a look at that's building these testing bots. It's sort of a framework in which you can build your own testing bots to test your own games. And I think it's definitely worth a look.
Yeah, this is one of those areas that is a sneaky part of a cost center within specifically AAA studios, where right now QA is just literally you're paying people to go and try and break your game, like actual humans go and try and break your game, and it's not that. I mean, it's definitely not sexy or glamorous work. It is. I mean, it's you're not actually playing the game, like you're trying to like break it, like literally. And so this feels like one of those areas where a sneaky amount of the margin is sort of being leaked off into this world that is certainly up for grabs with AI these days.
Oh, for sure. I mean, we had hundreds of testers in the Jamdat days, and in the Activision days, probably close to 1,000 who would work on just that, right? Just the idea of breaking these games. And somebody would be really good at finding, stray polygons in the Quake engine where you could potentially camp on a wall that didn't look like you could climb it. Well, sometimes the artists would leave in these random stray polygons, and under the right circumstances, you could climb that wall. And there were people in our testing department who were just experts in doing that particular thing. And as you said, it is very much not sexy work, and it is expensive because it is brute force body count work.
Yeah, there's another piece which is, we've talked about game tooling and whether those are viable businesses and as standalone startups. I think in this particular case, there's an opportunity because I don't think anyone actually views this as a core competency of their business. If anyone thinks that QA is their differentiator of why they're winning against the competition, then I would be really shocked. And so instead, I think there is a world where a third-party provider here actually just can win and get everyone to be using them.
So one of the other interesting aspects of this use of this technology in this context is what I guess we'll broadly call adaptive features, right? So this is the idea of learning entities inside of the game itself, whether that is at the design level. So for example, dynamic quests and adventures. We've talked about in the past, this idea of a game that would learn your play style, a game that would look at the composition of your party and the various skill levels and design narrative and difficulty that would be appropriate to the party that you're potentially adventuring with in that game context, that the quest that you're going on. Dynamic levels of difficulty have been around since the earliest days. You mentioned it earlier, this idea of playing easy, medium, hard, but the idea that you could have much more highly adaptive levels of difficulty and really potentially trainers, right, that would play against you in order to make you better at the game by exploiting your weaknesses, could be very, very interesting.
Yeah, it's your supervised learning bit that you had on Civ. You could totally imagine there's something very similar for the actual end user, which is like, hey, you keep holding your crosshair lower than it should be, like, or like, hey, you keep running out there like constantly for some reason, like wait 3 seconds.
Yep.
That is certainly going to help.
And then there's NPCs. And I think we've seen, because that is so obvious, right? We've seen a lot of investment around this idea of intelligent NPCs in games. I'm not as bullish about that as perhaps others. I think the number of opportunities to deploy NPCs that are really highly differentiated is limited. I mean, obviously we've seen examples in things like Red Dead Redemption or, in various other sort of strongly narrative games, The Last of Us, other games like that, where, your interactions with NPCs are at a fairly high level. And certainly the idea of including, natural language processing and other kinds of behavioral adaptations from large language models would be extremely interesting. and the like. I'm just not sure economically if the quote unquote intelligent NPC market is big enough to justify some of the valuations that we're seeing for some of the companies in that space.
Yeah, I think, and for people who aren't familiar with what NPC means, we're referring to the non-playable characters of a game. And I think that my view, which is sort of similar to what you just said, is it's possible that a game like Red Dead Redemption, and let's just say Rockstar maybe in general, NPCs are a real core competency of them. And that is, up until this point, has been a real way of them differentiating and winning, because they understand that play pattern, or how to embrace NPCs while still building the constraints of a great game around it. It's possible that they should just be the ones that lead this next era. But that would be my view, is that this NPCs are such a core part of something like Rockstar that I will personally be shocked if they end up going with a third-party provider versus continuing to build it in-house.
Interesting. I think you're probably right about that, although I do think that potentially, again, in a bull case, the availability of the sort of NPC intelligence as a platform that you could potentially rent and use to develop your own characters might level that playing field to a certain degree, because I think right now the investment that it takes to make a game like Red Dead Redemption, as we know, is fast approaching like $1 billion in terms of, and requires insanely specialized set of skills in order to really pull off. And again, to the extent that that could be in any way sort of attacked or chipped into to some extent through the use of some of these technologies, that could be very interesting for the industry. I'm just not sure how ubiquitous those NPCs are in games, such that increasing their intelligence tenfold would make that much of a play difference, would make that much of a fun difference.
Yeah, that's maybe the larger view, which is, do NPCs, and again, but we talked about trying to see the present clearly. Today, NPCs are not a major differentiator of why you are playing a game. Even in a GTA or Red Dead, you're playing those games because they're just so, I mean, there are so many aspects that they have absolutely crushed. NPCs are one element of it. And I think my biggest concern around the NPC landscape today is that most people are just saying, like, let's make these NPCs intelligent. You can talk to them and, you know, play these dynamic games, but they're actually missing the constraints, or like, what is a real version of a game? There's too much open agency when talking to these rather than building the constraints.
Yeah. Yes. Why is that fun, right? I mean, you always have to ask that question, right? It's like, why is it fun?
Yes, exactly.
You know, we got these large language models. We can create natural language responsiveness in an NPC. The question should really be why.
Yes, exactly.
So let's move on to behavior analysis and player preference, which is the last of the categories that we're going to talk about in this idea of kind of implementations of AI in games currently. One of the most interesting, I think, is in moderation and live ops. And what Dennis Fong is doing with GGWP is super interesting. We worked with Dennis on Lithium back in the day, and I was actually there to see him win the Ferrari from Carmack back in the day. And so, you know, long association with Dennis, and I'm very excited by what he's doing in this company, and I know we're using it, one of my portfolio companies, to great success. So I think that's something super interesting. And again, we've seen Valve talk about the fact that they're now using some of these learning models for CSGO cheating mitigation.
Yeah, there's a blessing and a curse of this new world, is that it's possible that AI maybe just breaks all anti-cheat and it's indistinguishable of what is actually cheating. And there's the other side, which is anti-cheat should get better. And so it feels like we're a little bit of an arms race of who wins that. But I mean, if you play Call of Duty Warzone or one of these games, it is clear that, I mean, maybe more today than ever before, the cheating and mods of that are just completely breaking. And it's a problem that maybe is unsolvable.
That's going to be a little bit like performance enhancing drugs in sports to a certain extent, right? Where, you know, it's both a blessing and a curse. The other area that I think is really interesting in terms of behavioral analysis of players is this idea of churn reduction for games as a service. And I have some experience of this. Genova Chen at that game company has developed a tool that they use to watch play inside of the Sky environment. And it looks at player behavior and it subjects it to a deep learning model, and it spots these hot spots, these areas either of potential cheating or, more interestingly, of potential lapse where players have abandoned their character, or they haven't played for a while, or they're playing sporadically, or they're lost or stuck. And you can see it in real time in the tool. It's super interesting. And maybe, again, sort of matched with some of these more sophisticated AIs that are being developed in the future, it may be possible to automate, for example, messaging to those players to send bots out to help those players, right? NPCs and other things like that in order to again, enhance that player's experience and prevent a noob, for example, from just abandoning the game immediately if they feel like it's over their head.
Yeah, it's churn reduction, and then there's a bit of like actually trying to identify the type of player that you have, right? And so there's a world where if right now every player is sort of treated equally, maybe they're segmented by number of hours spent or dollars spent or whatever that might be. But the reality is, if you think of Bartle's taxonomy and how open some of these games are, it's really important as quickly as possible to identify what that is and what type of player you're dealing with, so that way you can cater it closer to them. And I think that is we're just at the tip of the iceberg of starting to explore and understand what that means.
I think that's going to be really cool. And it is very similar in some ways to what we were talking about before about dynamic gameplay, about the idea of these like dynamic quests or other things like that. I do think, and the mention of Bartle's taxonomy, I think is very important in this context, which is people do really bring their own play styles to these things. And if you could identify them and conform or tailor the experience to their style, you're more likely to potentially retain them moving forward. So it will have a real business implication in that context. I guess the last bit I want to talk about before we sort of go a little broader is the implications of this in the distribution context. Obviously, if you've listened to us enough, you know that distribution is near and dear to our heart. I do think that there is a potential dark side of this technology in the distribution context in terms of enhanced ad targeting, the idea of being able to micro-target and dynamically create content on the fly for 3 people and serve them an ad that you don't serve to anyone else, for example. I've seen as well some people talking about this idea of offering personalized gameplay derived from these deep learning models and charging for it, right? That you get the same gameplay that everybody else gets if you're a non-payer, but if you pay, then that's a new business model and you get an adaptive gameplay experience that's differentiated from the core gameplay experience. And I think, hey, you know what? It could be innovative, could be interesting, could really suck.
Yeah, I mean, I talked to a company fairly recently that it was doing sort of the Bartle's taxonomy of identifying the type of player you are, but really on the whale side of like, is this person a whale, or what boosts do they like the most, and really targeted towards mobile games, but then doing customized shops based on that. And again, that's, you could say that's really dark, but it's also, if we know anything about mobile games, is they might be the most capitalistic of any of them, and that yes. if you aren't doing that, you're certainly going to go to that edge. I think there's another piece, which is what you're describing of these hyper targeted ads. I think that's for sure will happen, and what that means is like this might be a solution on some level to the IDFA world of if you can't target everyone, or if you have to target everyone, you have to basically figure out what type of player or who's actually going into it. And one way to do that is to make these more hyper targeted ads. Where instead of
tracking via a pixel that follows you around the internet in a creepy way that everybody seems to really dislike, I don't know that they'll necessarily be more amenable to the idea of having their behavior analyzed at that level. But again, it's happening. We know it's happening in sort of the location. I mean, the weather app environment in iOS is a really interesting case in point. Virtually every one of those weather apps gathers location data and sells it to aggregators, right? I mean, that's basically the business model of a lot of these crap ass like weather apps. And if that's the case, right, it's like I mean, maybe we should go into the bot business to protect you against those kinds of attacks by obfuscating your behavior online to make it seem like you're not who they think you are. But I don't know, man. But I just see it as fairly dark.
Yeah, I think mobile. My hot take is that this might end up in a world where everyone just ends up in a mastery puzzle game, and this is the end game of everyone's getting targeted in ads, and the moment they figure out you're a whale, you end up in that world. So that's my one prediction I'll throw out here, rather than seeing the present clearly. That's my one hot take.
So let's move on from this. These uses of artificial intelligence and potential use of artificial intelligence, and talk a little bit about who we think the winners and the losers are going to be in this transformation, to the extent that it is a transformation. And again, I'm taking the position that this will be disruptive and transformative in some fundamental way to the way games are created. And if that's the case, who stands to gain? Who stands to lose?
I mean, obviously, there's always the question of incumbents when something like this happens. The classic innovator's dilemma. I'm curious how you view that today.
I think the incumbents, to the extent that this happens quickly, and by all accounts, having watched what's happened with GPT, for example, out of OpenAI, and Gemini out of Google, and what's happening across the industry broadly, even beyond the video game business, it's hard to bet against the fact that this is going to happen quickly. And if it happens quickly, I think the incumbents may be uniquely vulnerable in a way that perhaps they've never been before. And I'll say why. The reason that I think they are uniquely vulnerable is because of the inherent current structure of AAA game development. Now, all of the current layoffs notwithstanding, the number of people that are on staff to create AAA games at the incumbent publishers, those teams are enormous. And they're not, and okay, maybe they're getting slightly smaller, but these rifts that we've seen in the industry are typically, 10 to 20% on a per company basis. I mean, obviously the impact is much greater because they're happening across the industry. And so it's 20% from every company rather than, just sporadic layoffs here and there. That said, these companies are still hugely staffed. And I think to the extent that you could take, let's say, an order of magnitude, and I think this is not a fantasy. I think it's realistic to assume that through the use of all of these tools, and look, you and I have seen it. We've talked to some developers who've started down this path where they've decided to make a game using all of the available AI technology that's currently out there, and it is producing ridiculous productivity increases to the extent that it really could be half an order or an order of magnitude reduction in headcount in order to make a comparable quality game. And if that's the case, that's going to really hurt the incumbents because they've already got these projects rolling with hundreds and hundreds of people assigned to these projects, to these art projects, et cetera. And whether or not that means the disruption of further layoffs, which have morale implications and all kinds of other psychological implications for the progress of those projects. You also have the fact that they're burdened with this speed of execution that the smaller potential game team would not be burdened by. And I think there is going to be a window of opportunity to challenge incumbents in AAA over the next maybe 24 to 36 months that could be really profound. And again, we looked at what happened with the introduction of the internet and online play games as a service and how it enabled the creation of this incredible value creation for companies like Valve, for companies like Riot. And then we looked at mobile and that platform transition and how those technologies helped create all of this incredible value creation around companies like Supercell, like King, et cetera. I think this may have a similar opportunity. And I think it is worth keeping an eye on this space because I do think that there is the possibility that an out of left field company like Riot emerges fundamentally out of this AI environment.
Yeah, I think that's 100% right. And I think there's a little bit of, the difference, let's say in what you're talking about with King or those were obviously real distribution innovations and opportunities of actual platform shifts. In this case, it almost feels like a content flattening on some level of it's okay if this team of 4 can go and create something that is comparable to a team of 50 in 3 years of work. I'm with you. Like they're certainly vulnerable, and I think there's another sort of the people part of this or culture part of this is you're naturally going to have resistance from the artists, and we talked about at the beginning of this episode of like, can you train on my stuff? Can you not? What is all of that is those are very real discussions and even more difficult sort of debates that you'll have to have internally. And I can't imagine the discussions that some of these teams are having, especially some of these art teams where it's like, hey, we want to go and use these pipelines or we want to go and use these assets to build all this out and move faster, but they're resisting.
So I think that content flattening idea I want to come back to because I think it is the incumbent's potential competitive advantage in this circumstance, which is to the extent that the incumbents possess strong IP and to the extent that the incumbents possess an aggregated audience in an era where cloning becomes essentially instantaneous because you could essentially train an artificial intelligence on the game that you want to clone and just have it essentially go off and automate the cloning. And the idea that innovation is going to basically be removed as a potential premium, and we've already seen it in advance of artificial intelligence, yes. How quickly content has become indefensible in the video game business in a lot of ways. Absent that distribution advantage, it may be that the incumbents come out of this less vulnerable because the whole rest of the industry basically destroys itself with a flood of low quality content.
Yeah, that is a very real concern. And you talked about it a little bit earlier where if I want to go and create a match 3 game, certainly we should be able to do that even in today's world with the tools that we have. And so we're going to be entering a crazy era of, and it's up to the app stores in a lot of ways to figure out how to police this. But we're entering like everything can just be flooded there. And there might be, call it 1 million match 3 games if there's like, call it 1,000 on there right now. And what does that mean? Is it probably means Candy Crush and Royal Match and those giants get stronger and more than anything else.
Yeah, it is really an interesting problem. And I think it's a problem made worse by the fact that it's happening at a time when the platforms themselves, the mass market platforms, the Steams, the iOS App Store, have abandoned really curation of any meaningful degree, right? I mean, the flood of content that already exists onto those platforms and the relative lack of curation is exactly the kind of thing that we need. We need curation in order to weed out all of this crap that we're likely to see, particularly, I think, in the casual and mobile space. I mean, I am just terrified of the implications of generative AI in those spaces where, it was bad enough in hyper casual, right? I mean, hyper casual was already offensive enough to me in terms of its implications for gameplay. And now we're going to see, I think, hyper-casual, like that problem of hyper-casual replicated infinitely in these spaces. And I think without meaningful curation, it could get ugly.
Yeah, I mean, I could not agree more. And I think it goes back to the point that you were making earlier, which is it might be that IP is the real winner here. And it might be that, the incumbents, because they already have the distribution, they already have the audience aggregated, and especially if they have strong IP, they're going to be the only ones that can really cut through the noise moving forward.
So interesting. I think on the player side, there's some really interesting opportunities, right? I mean, I think, for example, UGC tooling, right, which is currently of varying degrees of difficulty, but the ability to, for example, make mods at the highest level of sort of UGC problem certainly will be mitigated and solved in some ways by the generative AI models. But even, and you're seeing things like Eggy Party again in China, which the UGC is proving to be a bit of a moat for that game, right? Tencent took them on with a clone, and Tencent certainly has the market power to make a clone like that happen. And they lost. And Eggy Party emerged from that combat even stronger. And in a lot of ways, did so because of the moat created by the UGC, that people wanted to play on the maps and levels and structures that they themselves had created for themselves and their friends, and that was enough of a retention tool to increase the switching costs. So obviously, I would say I'm a big believer in UGC for that purpose, and anything that will make the availability of UGC and the quality of UGC greater, I think is a net win for the industry and for those companies that will implement it.
Yeah, I mean, you talk about like audience aggregation in the context of Fortnite or UEFN and Roblox. If you can reduce the barriers to create for those platforms dramatically, we might be entering a whole new era. Those are a completely different beast of a platform moving forward.
Yeah, I mean, if I were in there at Roblox or at Epic, I would be investing heavily in these technologies on the UGC side. So let's make some predictions. And I think at the highest level, it's worth thinking about whether this AI revolution, to the extent that it occurs, augurs the best period in the history of the video game business in terms of content and quality, or the worst period in the history of gaming. And honestly, I'm not entirely sure which way I come out on this one.
I mean, I think I can guess where your head's at for both of those, but I think it's really worth diving into like why you're saying it will be the worst for the best. And so maybe let's just talk about the worst. Like what happens in that scenario?
Well, I think before we do, I think it's worth thinking about whether or not it's likely to happen or not, right? I mean, well, let's just draw the example, for example, of autonomous cars, right? 10, 12 years ago, when we were Uber investors, when Bill was on the board and they were acquiring Otto to build out their autonomous driving, and others in the industry, Cruise and various other companies, were investing very heavily in this idea of autonomous driving. You know, there was sort of a bull case and a bear case, and the bull case was like, it's going to happen tomorrow, right? And you see sort of the maximalists like Elon Musk and others who are like, oh yeah, they're hand waving the problem, right? It's like, yeah, like it's just a matter of time, and that time is going to be very short, and we're going to have a fully autonomous cars and whatever. And then there was a bear case, and I hate to say it, but I was bearish on autonomous cars, and I was taking it's going to take 20 years. Because it's not so much that you can't get some distance toward it, but it's that last bit that like will ends up killing you, right? It's in the 5 nines. Literally. It's the last 2 nines that really that are really the hard part. And again, you see recently Apple, who took a 10-year, $10 billion run at autonomous driving, abandoned the project and reassign the engineers to more mundane and fundamental AI projects. Similarly, look, we've gone through this with virtual reality, where the hype cycle gets way out ahead of the reality of the devices and consumer demand for those devices. And, you know, it's worth being somewhat cautious about how quickly this happens. I think the difference with artificial intelligence is that we are really seeing progress compounding in a way that seems to be accelerating.
Yeah,
right? It seems to be moving this forward way faster than, you know, autonomous driving, way faster than virtual reality, way faster than any of these other pretender technologies, Web3. And I think in that way, it would be foolish to bet entirely against it.
Yeah, I mean, I tend to agree in that we're basically trying to find the constraints to what would like hold back the innovation here at this point, and it's really compute and maybe training data is sort of the
regulation.
Yeah, and regulation. And
I think it's regulate. I think regulation is the greatest potential that could slow down the state of progress, because if the copyright regime ends up being interpreted such that training on publicly available data is implicated, these models are going to be much less useful, and there's going to be much more of a horse trade that's going to happen over these pools of available data that are going to be used for training. And you can already see it. I mean, to a certain extent, the big incumbents with their LLMs are already approaching the Reddits, the Discords of the world with deals to go in and roll up their data. So, but again, I would say regulation is probably the greatest enemy of progress here, or depends on your definition of progress, is the greatest enemy of artificial intelligence taking over. Yep. So what's the bear case? The bear case here is that, in my opinion, AI does to the games business what it's likely to do to the news business, which is that it eviscerates the business opportunity for anyone other than the top content suppliers. I mean, we see this in news with the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal. It hollows out the entire middle and basically everything else is algorithmically generated crap. And so what is the result of that? The distribution platforms get stronger. The market gets flooded with low quality trash posing as content. Again, same thing that happened in news. And the rich get richer.
Yeah, and I now see why you say how you can say it's either one, because there is certainly one part of me that can view that as the way this plays out. And actually, I think that's the most likely way that this plays out.
Unfortunately, I think so too. I mean, I think that there's a real risk that indies just get driven out of the market due to unprofitability because they're cloned out of existence basically by these models, and that this low attention span user base that we've seen in the hyper casual context, this idea, play something for a day and move on to the next thing. They're going to have all of the content they could ever want. And if anything, we may see the sort of TikTokization of the games business with this low attention span user base super served. And I think that's disastrous on a certain level.
Yeah, and you've talked about this earlier, which is just it in a world where these markets are flooded, and by markets, let's just say the app stores themselves, the distribution here is broken. And actually, what really the people that win is a lot of what we just talked about, which is it might be the UGC platforms, or it might be the incumbents who have already aggregated these audiences, because it's hard to imagine the hack on distribution moving forward of how you're going to aggregate these audiences.
And let me slightly apologize to people working in the hyper casual business, because my distaste for that business is a personal preference. But I will say, Blake, you sent me a video recently that I found absolutely remarkable, which was a conversation with a game designer at, I won't name it, but one of the leading hyper casual companies whose business has been basically destroyed by the IDFA and other advertising and tracking changes. And they've had to move to a more traditional pay-to-play model or virtual goods model or upsell model. And the thing goes on for an hour, and basically the dude is like, oh man, now I actually have to make good games. Right? Like that's his conclusion. And I'm like, oh, for fuck's sake. Right. I mean, it's just unbelievable to me. So
hey, I'm the sucker who plays these hyper casual games. I'm on the other side of this than Mitch, which is I'll play any game that has numbers going up. That's the type of player I am. So you can keep marketing them to me.
So why don't you take us through the bull case?
Ooh. Well, I think, for all of the reasons of why you think that the market will be flooded is where you have to have the same stem of that it goes the other direction of we're in a new renaissance, which is if in a world where it's flooded means that anyone can create these games. And what that really means is that you're lowering sort of the premium price of what a premium game experience is. And the indies are supercharged in the context of what we talked about earlier, where there is a 4-person team that's able to make a game that a team of 500 was making. That is remarkable. And so in the bear case where it's unprofitable to be an indie, it's your actual costs are just way lower. And so the hurdle to get to that profitability is just way lower. So I think that is for sure one part of the bull case, which is just that the co-pilots and the asset generation, all of these things, just sort of the cost goes down to zero. And what that really means is actually that you're focusing on like really great games. And you're no longer thinking about art as a constraint. You're no longer thinking about, can I build this on Unreal versus Unity? You're thinking purely around like, how do I build a great play pattern or a great, very novel game? And that is, to me, is where this is what you would have to believe is it unlocks the bull case, is letting anyone be a game designer should unlock these more novel gameplay patterns and just beautiful and amazing games that you and I would never even imagine or think of.
I think that's right. And I think there's a corollary as well, which is that, and I can already start to see it in the context of some of the AI art generation like Midjourney and DALL-E, which is this idea of AI look exhaustion. That's kind of my term for it, right? Which is like we see these things and we've seen them enough. And frankly, Midjourney and DALL-E each have their own kind of house style in terms of how they do generate these things from the prompts. And you can really tell, right? I mean, it's not so much the uncanny valley, it's just that it looks like AI generated art. And I think that there may be a bit of a blowback at some point in the future where we get tired of looking at this AI generated art and these AI generated experiences. And there's sort of a revenge of hand-drawn, low res, highly concentrated, like quirky gameplay rather than sort of, the kind of race to the bottom that we may see in terms of all these models being trained on all the same data.
Yeah, and it's interesting because the past couple of years of games, or I don't know, let's say even the past decade of games, if we've learned anything around that, it's that art style and art quality of like it needs to look realistic or any of that stuff is not at all a component of whether your game works or has commercial success. And so in a world where it's like, oh, okay, everyone can go and make a AAA looking game, that actually doesn't really mean that much possibly in this new world, because what we know is that the people that are rewarded are either they're figuring out the distribution angle of how they're going to go and aggregate this audience, or they're coming up with these novel gameplay patterns. And that's what I suspect will be rewarded moving forward.
Cool. Well, this, as you said, will likely be our least evergreen episode that we ever record. It will be fun to come back in a couple of years and see how much we got wrong. And with that, I think that concludes this season of the Gamecraft podcast. Blake, thank you so much. It's always such a pleasure to get to hang out with you and talk about these things. And I really appreciate it.
No, thank you. I mean, it's hard to believe that we're already on the finale, but season 2 coming to a wraps, and yeah, thank you, Mitch. I mean, every time we talk, I learned so much. Even in the preparation for these episodes, I learned so much. So thank you.
And for the audience, we do this ad-free. We do it. I don't think we've ever asked you to like or subscribe or smash any button or whatever. But I would encourage anyone who has found value in this and has derived even a modicum of pleasure from listening to us banter over the last 8 hours of episodes to please leave us a review if you would be so inclined, because it will help others discover the podcast because of the way these artificially intelligent algorithms sort podcasts. And so, we would love to expand our reach and have more people listen to it. I think we already have a wonderful audience, often very vocal, and we appreciate it. And so to the extent that you would be so inclined, we would greatly appreciate it if you could let others know.
That was the kindest version of Mitch asking, please leave a review, 5-star review for us. So I'll say the more blunt version, but thank you.
Thank you, and on.